So I want to try to put this whole zero Satoshi debate, which really shouldn't be a debate, to rest. Essentially what's going on is when you have a Bitcoin transaction, right, we can just say TX here. This transaction can have multiple outputs. Some of these can be, we'll just give each output here a value. Maybe this one has 100 Satoshis, this one has 0 Satoshis, and this one has 3,301 Satoshis. So there's 3 outputs to this transaction, and of course it's got some inputs which come from, in this case, a place that doesn't really matter. Now, if we ask ourselves, in order to create a new transaction, in order to create a new thing that spends money, each of the inputs to this transaction that we're creating, so inputs on the left here, must all be UTXOs, right? The Bitcoin protocol dictates that every input to a transaction must be a UTXO. It must be an unspent transaction output, every one of them. There's no having an input that is not a UTXO from the UTXO set. So if we arbitrarily define over here this concept of the UTXO set, right, then every valid UTXO is then made a part of this UTXO set. And then any transaction can then, use the TXID and the VOUT number to figure out which UTXO they want to spend. What's happening here is we're actually not creating 3 UTXOs. What Craig has been saying about this zero Satoshi thing is that this may be a valid transaction, right? And it's okay because because this transaction is valid, this first one up here, to have an output that is 0. So maybe this is op return, right? Or whatever it is. You're really not supposed to, well, op return is okay. You're allowed to add things as an additional kind of tag, but in terms of entries to the UTXO database, what's being seen here is that this 0 output, this 0 Satoshi output is not a valid entry in the UTXO set. So when somebody takes this 0 output value here and they want to come over here and use it as an input, as a UTXO, and when they take it, it doesn't matter whether the script executes, because this 0 Satoshi output is not a valid entry in the UTXO set. So when they've taken this 0 value output and said, oh, the script evaluates, so therefore we're going to use it as a UTXO, this is a violation of the Bitcoin protocol. The reason why is because this 0 Satoshi output is not a UTXO. UTXOs must contain Satoshis. As a condition of being a UTXO in the UTXO set, they must contain Satoshis. And so the fact that this 0 Satoshi output was actually entered as a possible thing that could have been spent as an input in the first place was an error. What needs to happen is that when you make a 0 output thing, it doesn't matter if it's op return or if the script is a pay to public key hash. It doesn't matter if it is a 0 output. If there are no Satoshis associated with the script, whatever that script may be, the transaction can be valid that creates the 0 output script, but it is not a valid entry in the UTXO set, and you cannot take this 0 output thing and then use it as a UTXO because it's not a UTXO. So I hope that makes it a bit more clear. So this transaction, if even one of the inputs are 0, that transaction is actually spending something that is not a UTXO, and it is therefore not valid as a Bitcoin transaction. So you cannot take that and have a 0 output. You cannot have a 0 output from a transaction that is then taken in a new transaction and used as a UTXO. So what I could do, I could take this output for 100 Satoshis, and I could take this output for 3301 satoshis, and those are valid as entries in the UTXO set. So then some other transaction could come along and it could spend the 3301 or it could spend the 100, and that's perfectly fine. That's what we do all the time. Now everyone says, okay, well, all these op return things should then be not allowed. Well, no, they're fine. They're fine because we're not using them as input. They're fine. They're not entries in the UTXO set. Somebody attached them kind of extraneously to a transaction to tag it with some extra data. That's benign. That's okay. And the problem that we face here is that when we have this zero Satoshi thing and we actually start to now use it as an input, the transaction that first took this and used it as an input incorrectly, because we've incorrectly been treating these, if it's spendable or whatever, you think it's spendable, well, it obviously must be. They've incorrectly taken it and they've put it in the UTXO set so that other transactions could then take it and spend it. Basically, if we're going to make a couple of changes so that we don't run into this problem anymore, if we want to write our code and our implementations to kind of reject this, we could do two things, right? Number one, we could say that every transaction input, so if I'm going to make another transaction here, every transaction input must be greater than 0. So the output must be greater than 0, but that's not even the point. The point is that when I try to spend a transaction vout index on its TXI, so when I try to use one of these as input, it should not even be available in the UTXO set to begin with. So when this transaction, if we're now looking at this specifically to the UTXO set, what it does to the UTXO set. So we think of this first transaction here, right? It spends some inputs and then it says creating output 100 Satoshis. That's a valid entry into the UTXO set. But according to the UTXO set itself, we're not doing anything here. This no longer is even, there's no entry in the UTXO set that corresponds with that second output there because it's a 0 output. Every entry in the UTXO set needs to have Satoshis attached to it. And so if we actually just take our current, what we currently view as the UTXO set of available things that could be potentially spent and make a change so that it no longer includes those things that are 0. So all the op returns and all these weird script things that people have created that are pay to address or pay to public key hash, but then it's 0. Those are no longer, they're treated as if they're just not valid entries in the UTXO set. That's the real change that needs to be made here in order to make it so that this is valid. In order to, essentially the reason why this is a violation of the protocol is because we're actually using a UTXO which was not part of the UTXO set as an input. You can never use an input that is not part of the UTXO set. I hope that's kind of cleared things up here. I don't know, Craig Wright did a good interview, Bitcoin Class with Satoshi channel by Chao Hui, and I recommend you check out that as well, but this is a bit more of a condensed version of it. I hope it's hopefully cleared this up in everybody's mind. So people that build software that track UTXOs, what you need to do is exclude transactions from the UTXO set where there is 0 as an output. And any transaction that tries to spend from the UTXO set, you're checking against it, and any input must contain at least 1 Satoshi. So 0 input is essentially what we're talking about. If your input has 0 Satoshis, then it should not be valid because that input is not from the UTXO set. Hope that's cleared it up, and I'll publish this video on the MetaNet Slack and wherever else. Let me know if you still have any other questions, but I really do think this is pretty simple and it shouldn't need to be as complex as people are making it out to be.